There might be a reason you haven't figured it out yet, and it might not be the reason you think. There's a particular kind of quiet that follows a question no one asks out loud. Why haven't you figured it out yet? It doesn't have to be spoken. You feel it in a conversation where someone's career is consolidating and yours isn't. In a family gathering where the adults have stopped asking what you're working toward because they've been asking for a while. In the gap between where you are and where you assumed you'd be by now. The assumption underneath all of it is simple. If you haven't found your direction yet, something has gone wrong. You're behind, you're slower, you're evidence of unrealized potential. This video is about what the psychology of late development actually looks like and what it quietly produces that faster timelines often can't. The term late bloomer gets used loosely, so it's worth being precise. It describes a pattern, not a type of person. Someone whose meaningful development in career, creative work, relationships, or self-understanding arrives later than peers, or later than some ambient cultural expectation. It doesn't mean less intelligent, it doesn't mean less driven, and it doesn't look the same twice. For some, it's a career pivot at 40 that finally makes sense of everything that came before. For others, it's a creative practice that only found its footing late. For others still, it's simply knowing, clearly, who they are and what they actually want. That clarity can arrive on any schedule. What all those forms share, a gap between expectation and arrival, and everything that gap asks of you. The hardest part of developing late isn't the development itself. It's what happens in the space before it. Most people carry a rough timeline in their head. Not explicit, but ambient. When you should have direction. When you should be settled. That timeline isn't personal. It comes from watching others, from what school rewards, from what families celebrate, from what culture treats as proof you're on track. When your timeline diverges from that one, something specific happens. The gap gets internalized as a verdict. Not, my path is different, but I am behind. The external timeline becomes the measuring stick, and you start reading your own development through it. What that uncertainty demands is something most contexts never require. To keep moving without evidence, to stay in a question without an answer, to resist committing to the first direction that offers relief, even if it isn't the right one. Most people resolve the discomfort early, and that means something gets skipped. What gets skipped is where things get interesting. Research on identity development consistently shows that people who spend more time in genuine uncertainty, not avoidance, but honest not knowing, tend to arrive at a clearer, more stable sense of self, because it keeps the question open long enough to actually answer it. When you're not moving by momentum, not carried by an obvious next step or someone else's confidence, you're forced to ask a question that's easy to skip. What do I actually want? Not what makes sense on paper. What you actually want. Some people who've come through a long period of uncertainty describe it, in retrospect, as one of the most clarifying periods of their lives. Not while it was happening. After. They describe understanding, only later, that the longer search wasn't a failure of direction. It was the search doing what it needed to do. What it produces is a direction that was actually chosen. Not inherited from expectation, not borrowed from ambient pressure, built from the inside out. That's one part of the picture, but underneath it is something more specific and more portable. When external validation is available, milestones on schedule, peers confirming you're on track, you can move forward without ever building an internal compass. The external scaffolding does that work for you. Late bloomers lose that scaffolding, or never had it. The milestones don't arrive. The peer comparison doesn't reassure. And the confirmation that you're okay, that this is working, it simply isn't there in the way it is for everyone else. That creates a fork. Some people stop. Not dramatically, just gradually. concluding that the absence of validation means they should, that the silence means something. Others discover something underneath the noise, a quieter signal that doesn't depend on conditions being right or someone else believing in them first, something that could be called self-sourced motivation, the capacity to move from the inside rather than in response to external pull. That compass, once built, travels. It works when external validation is unavailable. It doesn't require anyone to go first. Understanding this is the first step. What comes next is more specific. The skill that comes out of this is learnable. It doesn't require a long or difficult path. And it doesn't appear automatically just because the path was long. It looks like this: learning to move without a green light. Most people are, without realizing it, waiting for permission, a credential, a title, someone else's visible confidence in them. Research on intrinsic motivation consistently finds that people who act from internal conviction, because something aligns with who they are, show more persistence and resilience than those acting for external recognition. Not because it's morally superior, because it doesn't collapse when the external environment stops reinforcing it. In practice, this looks like taking the next step before anyone confirms it's worth taking. It looks like continuing work no one is watching yet. And it looks like learning to tell the difference between "I'm not ready" and "I'm afraid," because they feel similar from the inside and require very different responses. The longer you practice moving from that internal signal, the more available it becomes. The longer you wait for the green light, the more dependent on it you become. There's no staying in place. None of this is an argument for taking longer. Some paths take longer for reasons worth understanding, some for reasons worth examining honestly. This video doesn't know which is true for you. What it does know is that these questions don't belong only to late bloomers. They belong to anyone who has felt the gap between where they are and where they assumed they'd be. Anyone who has quietly wondered whether their timeline is evidence of something wrong or something more complicated. Here are a few questions worth sitting with. Where in your life are you waiting for a green light that might not come on its own? When you look at the gap between expectation and where you actually are, whose expectation is that? And how did it get there? What would you continue pursuing if no external milestone would ever confirm it was the right choice? Is the path you're on one you built, or one you found yourself on? And what has the uncertainty already produced in you that you haven't yet given yourself credit for? Late development rarely announces itself as valuable at the time. It tends to reveal what it was only in retrospect, once what it produced has had a chance to be used. The direction doesn't have to be clear yet. It has to be honest.